Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you are. My name is Shoon Lim, and I'm very happy to be opening this session today on Words That Unite, Mastering Inclusive Language with all of you. So a little bit of a brief introduction of myself and then what we're going to be covering today with you in the 90 minutes that we have. I'm a consultant at Russell Reynolds Associates based in Singapore, doing DE&I consulting work. And before this, been doing D&I now for 15 over years in various organizations like Shell, Microsoft, and Givaudan. My pronouns are she and her, and I am a Chinese woman, middle age, with brown hair, and today I'm wearing a black top and spectacles as well. And without further ado, just want to quickly cover that we have an hour with a panel of esteemed speakers who will be talking about their experiences with inclusive language. And then we'll run a 30 minutes practical workshop after that on how you can practice inclusive language as well. So very quickly, just going on to who will be on the panel today with us. So I have Michael Martens, who is the founder of Fair Language. And Michael advises organizations on all aspects of inclusive communication and visibility of women and other genders in language. Before Fair Language, he led and consulted on digital transformation projects and has inspired over 100 different groups and workshops and seminars. His pronouns are he and him. The next speaker on the panel is Dr. Subatra Jayaraj, who is a primary care in reproductive health specialist. She has experience in anesthesia and intensive care in the Ministry of Health in Malaysia and has worked at the UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific based in Bangkok, where she was focused on a 20-year review of the ICPD Program of Action. She has managed sexual and reproductive health programs in crisis situations in Southeast Asia and Pacific regions, and currently the president of Reproductive Rights Advocacy Alliance in Malaysia, and she runs a primary care women's health clinic focusing on sexual and reproductive health in Petaling Jaya, Malaysia. Her pronouns are she and her. Next, we have Shaleen Chrisanne, who is a clinical psychologist. She is based in Malaysia as an LGBTQ affirming clinical psychologist, very passionate in advocating for mental health, LGBTQ plus rights, women's rights, and the rights of all marginalized groups. Recognizing that mental health climate in Malaysia currently isn't inclusive enough for the LGBTQ plus community, she has dedicated most of her training and career to focus on the mental health of this community. Shaleen has a lot of experience working with human rights defenders and organizations such as PLUHO, Justice for Sisters, New Narrative, Innovation for Change East Asia, Women's Fund Asia, UN Women Asia, and the Pacific, and much more. She has given many talks and trainings on topics related to mental health and human rights to various NGOs, health professionals, and known institutions. Her pronouns are she and her. And then Khoo, last but not least, is a consultant with Catalyze, and he has been consulting on DE&I for cultural transformation of corporations, and brings 20 years of experience in MNCs, governments, startups, and SMEs. His passion lies in fusing different disciplines to create original solutions that balance human dignity and business objectives. He's a co-founder of transgendersg.com, Singapore's volunteer-run resource site. TransSG enables safe access to healthcare and destigmatization for individuals. Rain is also the founder of Dignite Brands, which works on brands to deliver social and environmental impact. His pronouns are he and him. We'll find out a little bit more over the panel in a short while more about each of them. In the meantime, though, we'd like to give you a definition for inclusive language, as well as to run a quick poll so that we can get a sense of your experience as participants in encountering inclusive language. So it's interesting, when we were looking for a definition, I will share that there was a dictionary definition online that basically gave a whole list of don'ts. And this was one of the few definitions where, in addition to what not to do in inclusive language, actually talks about what to do. So I like this very much, and it's on helpfulprofessor.com. And as you can see, it refers to the use of language that promotes equality, respect, and sensitivity towards all individuals, regardless of their demographic backgrounds. And many are listed here. And it aims to avoid any language that excludes or that stereotypes or marginalizes certain groups. So a great definition. So with that definition, I would like to invite all of you to log into menti.com and use this code for us to run a couple of questions. I think just 3 questions with you. So I'm Menti side. I see one person has signed in. Anybody else? We're just waiting for a few more people to join so that we are able to take part and run the poll. So I see 4 or 5 of you now. Thank you. So QR code is there as well as the Menti code. Anyone else? Yeah, 11, great. 12. Fantastic. So please sign into the Menti. We have 3 polls for you. Okay, so we have quite a few now, and while waiting for everyone else to join, I'm going to start the poll. And when the poll has started, you will still see the code at the top, so you are able to still join at any time. So the first question is, what are some examples of non-inclusive language you might have encountered or observed? So whether you have experienced it or whether you have observed it, please type in as open responses. You're also able to vote up anybody else's response as you are participating in this. Show the results as they're coming in. Okay, so what are some examples? Please do this, girl. Yes, I have heard that too. And no matter how old you are, even if you're 50 years old and then being told, please do this, girl. He's so gay. Technical jargons, yes, that can be very much non-inclusive, misgendering. You are too young to understand, okay? Using just one pronoun. Maternity leave, ladies and gentlemen. You people, mate, that probably is Australian. Assuming the gender of the person, you look young. During my time, okay, yes. You don't look like you're married with children. Yeah, and that of course could apply to either men or women. People like you won't understand, yes. And for me personally, I've also found that acronyms can tend to be very much exclusive in their nature as well. She must be PMSing, yes. Unfortunately, yes, that does come up oftentimes too. Managers and doctors, so references to managers and doctors, etc., tend to default to the male pronoun as a habit. Yep, referring to a whole group of mixed gender people as guys. I'm guilty of that. So if I make that mistake in the session, I do apologize upfront and I ask for grace. I'm trying very hard to change that as a habit for me. Part-time employee, so reference to them being having less ambition and focus on family. Focuses on family, yeah, your generation. So great, fantastic. These are great examples, and I'm going to now move to the next poll. So given the definition we had earlier on inclusive language, which areas do you find easiest to practice inclusive language on? So it could be on gender identity, as you can see here, sexual orientation, maybe age, race, ethnicity, nationality, disability, mental health, neurodiversity. And then we have a catch-all. So if you have something where you feel that it's other, please share, and then maybe type into the Q&A section what that other is as well. So definition of inclusive language, which area is easiest? We can see that a number of you have put gender identity. You find that on the age dimension, it might be easiest to practice inclusive language as well. Interesting. Nationality, being conscious of nationalities and not stereotyping. Some people find that much easier. And interestingly, nobody has said that it's easy to practice inclusive language yet. On disability, oh, I was just about to say mental health and somebody has popped that in, and neurodiversity. So that's lagging a little bit behind, as well as ethnicity, which is interesting. Wondering why that is. So let's explore some of that. In Q&A, as well as with the panel in a while. Gender identity and age are right at the forefront in terms of what people find easiest, and then nationality coming up a close third. And somebody's put an other. So we'll be curious if you could use the Q&A channel just to type what that other is so that we can find out. That would be perfect as well. Okay, I'm going to move to the next question in the meantime. So we're going to flip around and ask, which one do you find hardest to practice inclusive language on which dimensions? You can pick multiple dimensions, just like with the first poll. Which ones are you struggling with? Wow, that was fast. So disability, mental health, neurodiversity. Somebody said gender identity as well. Neurodiversity is coming out right at the front. Disability too. Ethnicity is coming up too, so it's a reverse. But amongst the last three that had the least number of responses in the previous one, we can see that it's also not all the same. Some people are actually finding neurodiversity and disability much more challenging than mental health, which is interesting, and we'll explore that in a while. So thank you very much for the poll responses. It's great to see the interactivity wherever you are, whatever time of the day it is. We'll now come to the panel discussion itself, and I'm going to take down my screen so that we are able to see the panelists themselves. And yeah, so it was great to see all of the different responses. And what I'd like to start off with the panel discussion on is to ask each of our panelists, what does inclusive language mean to each one of them? And if they can provide some specific examples. And even as they are answering, please feel free at any time to post your questions onto the platform. We will be monitoring them. And we'll take the opportunity to answer the questions live as well. So very quickly, what does inclusive language mean to you? And I'm just going to go with Michael first to respond. And it's by alphabetical order. So no gender bias here. Yeah.
Fair enough. Yes. Yeah, thank you. So for me, inclusive language, maybe as an addition to your definition or the definition you presented earlier, would also include or can also include some active elements, some active behavior, active habits to make the world a bit more inclusive, the communication a bit more inclusive, because I think it's a great start to treat everyone equally and not harm anyone, be respectful, but also if we really want to create the same opportunities and the same possibilities for everyone, we need some more active elements, partly to do that. So I myself work heavily in the area of gender diversity and gender inclusive communication. I'm from Germany. In Germany, it's a very strongly discussed topic. I'm happy to share something about this also later. And to give you an example, one aspect that makes my communication more inclusive is sharing my pronouns. For example, when on a panel like this, I would introduce myself with my pronouns. I'm using he, him, male pronouns. Many people will say, but why is he sharing his pronouns? I can see he has a beard, he might have a bit of a deeper voice, he has short hair, he has a name Michael. I would assume that's a male name and so on. So there's no need that he shares the pronouns. But I don't agree with this because I'm sharing my pronouns to make this a topic, because not everyone has the luxury or the privilege to for people guessing the gender right. Yeah, like for trans people, for non-binary people, they are very often in the situation that people are assuming their gender, misgendering them, and assuming a wrong gender and wrong pronouns. Hence, I normalize this conversation, and I also, second point of it, I'm showing my openness towards the topic, my education towards the topic, and by this creating a more safe space for especially for non-binary and trans people to open up to me, for example, as a leader inside my organization or something like this. If I add my pronouns to my signature, I show I have some awareness of this topic. It makes it easier for others to approach me and open up to me. And that would be one example of how I, or how you also, all of you, can improve your communication to be a bit more inclusive towards trans and non-binary people and make in general the communication more inclusive.
Thanks, Michael. And it's a great way to show, as you were mentioning, being an ally, being an advocate, signaling safe space. So something as simple as pronouns can do so much in creating all of that and sending such strong signals. So thank you for sharing that. So in alphabetical order for now, then the next person, Rain, may I ask, what does inclusive language mean to you, and some specific examples?
Hi everyone, I'm a Chinese man wearing big glasses, collared shirt with a light colored background from Catalyzed Consulting, that's the wordings, working with organizations to build respectful, inclusive, safe and equitable workplaces. So to me, inclusive language is a magnetic positive force. It goes beyond conventional expressions of respect because it's able to create the space for a person to feel comfortable to share their thoughts and experiences with you. I'm going to touch on some examples and tips for neurodiversity and also intergenerational inclusion. In neurodiverse persons, inclusive language enables them to feel that they're not missing out on something in the conversation. When speaking with someone with ADHD, autism, or sensory processing disorders, language is usually kept direct, simple, and we avoid figures of speech. Someone should not need to infer what you really mean. And in a one-to-one situation, it could help to ask your listener to paraphrase their understanding so you can then adjust your language accordingly. There are also some trigger words that you should avoid based on the different neurodiversity. And for intergenerational inclusion, it helps to have a strength-based lens when you're talking to someone. So for example, for colleagues who are older, in this VUCA world of rapid change, older workers may feel that their experiences are not being valued as much as before. And words like, we need to bring fresh blood to bring fresh thinking may imply that, oh, they are getting stale. And we should avoid stereotypes, such as older workers being non-tech savvy, set in their ways, and avoid assumptions of what is their retirement preferences. Or against young colleagues that are, I think there was a couple of examples that was cited earlier in the Mentee meter, that usually it is ageism expressions such as, oh, you're too young to understand the company or to make a real impact, or to actually put them down and say, back in my time, we did this things this way and this way. And yeah, so these are a couple of tips and examples.
Thanks, Ray. And I think sometimes it goes reverse, right? Back in your time, you used to do this, now no longer as well. So it can also, all of these examples can flip one way or the other. Fantastic trigger words for us to bear in mind and remember. And then now on to Shaleen, if you can also share what does inclusive language mean to you and examples.
All right, thanks, Shoon. So for me, recognizing the way that we see the world is limited because of the language we use helps me understand the importance of inclusive language. So my understanding of people is limited because I simply don't have the words for it. So in terms of mental health, the words that I was introduced to growing up was terms like stress, crazy, psycho, retarded, things like that, right? So my understanding of mental health and well-being was very limited and very stigmatizing. So the idea of inclusive language for me in terms of mental health is using language that is respectful, that is empathetic, and free from stigmatization. So, especially when we talk about, really mental health related topics, which would then promote well-being for everyone. So one way that I use to know if my language is stigmatizing or not is to see if I would associate myself with it and kind of explore what kind of feelings that come with that. So if I feel uncomfortable associating myself with the term crazy, then for example, then there's a chance that the language that I'm using is stigmatizing. So what you want to do is you want to change that to a more inclusive one. So for an example, this using what we call as person first language is one way to be more inclusive. So instead of saying, an anxious person or a schizophrenic person, we say the term person with schizophrenia or person with anxiety, person with depression, right? Because mental health disorders are heavily stigmatized, when we use the disorder to sort of define someone, we run the risk of stigmatizing them and overgeneralizing them based on their disorder instead of who they are, which is not really true. Having a mental disorder is only one part of who you are. So this approach of using the person first humanizes the person and sort of helps to reduce labeling as well. Yeah.
Thanks. That's a great example, Shaleen. So the condition does not define the person's identity. It's just that the person happens to have the condition, but that this way of referencing restores the dignity of the person. Thank you for such a solid example. So on to you, Dr. Suba, and last but not least, asking you the same question. And in case everybody's wondering, why do I keep repeating the same question? I'm being inclusive because some people may have joined later. So if I just continued, then you wouldn't understand what was the question. So these are some examples of how we're trying to practice inclusive language in real time. So Dr. Suba, what does inclusive language mean to you? And can you provide specific examples? You're on mute, by the way. Yeah.
Yes, so waiting for four of us to speak. I'm Suba. I'm a brown-skinned woman with long hair and orange earrings. And inclusivity to me means creating an enabling environment that's non-judgmental and non-discriminative, and trying to address the differences in power relations because all of us have different identities. I work, for example, with communities and individuals who have different gender identities, and it's important for us to recognize that there is a diverse spectrum of individuals and how people choose to identify themselves. Frequently, misgendering tends to result in a lot of what's called minority stress, which doesn't only happen to those who have diverse gender identities. It happens throughout different identities, such as race, abilities, and also sexual orientation. So I think most important to be inclusive is to ask the person how would they like to be addressed, how would they like to be called, what kind of languages and words would they be comfortable with. Frequently, it's a very kind of, the poll showed us today, it's a new thing, but people are a bit hesitant when it comes to new ways of doing things. But I think it's quite surprising. I think lots of people are comfortable with gender and inclusivity. And I think it's because the more and more of the younger generation are very open to it. And that's what we've seen over the last couple of years, that the more we talk about being inclusive and using inclusive language, people become more comfortable with how we do. Inclusive language is not only, for example, in English, and Michael mentioned he was in Germany. Lots of us work in multi-language environments. So I think it's also important to look at different ways we speak. The formalities, sometimes we have informal ways of also speaking. So anything that is non-judgmental and non-discriminative makes everybody work better in an inclusive environment.
Thanks, Dr. Suba. And I love that you mentioned that it's not just in English. For me, I have learned sign language, and I realized that when people who are from the hearing impaired or deaf community text on WhatsApp, for example, their text actually mirror the signs and being very direct. And if I hadn't learned sign language, I would have read the text as being very rude, for example. But now I've learned to text in their way and how they like to interact as well. So it was a learning insight for me too. And it's a good reminder that inclusive language happens not just with English as the dominant language. So great. I'm going to now just ask different questions to each of the panelists, and maybe jumping in first with Rain, you shared on inclusive language as it applies in the context of neurodiversity and age inclusion. And you talked a lot about ageism, which is interesting because it's like one of those accepted areas sometimes where people feel like they can actually say these things like it's another generation, too young. In Singapore, we say when the policemen wear shorts, which means it's a long, long time ago. So it is important for communities to grow more inclusive language capability. That's how I feel as an ecosystem of support. In the context of a rapidly aging Asia as well as the world as a whole, what are some of the barriers that you see to accelerating this greater capability of people just having more inclusion around the notion of age in the use of language?
Thank you, Shoon. It's almost as though that the question is asking what kind of barriers might you face with older workers like me. And I think that there's a fine line between using it for acceptable humor and when it becomes exclusionary and non-inclusive. And what's tricky about it is that it's very much contextual. It depends on how well you know the person that you are speaking to, that all of you are able to read that this is a joke. And for example, the example that I gave, the joke's on me, so that's fine. And inclusive language is being shaped by younger generations who are holding corporations to a higher moral standard. But older workers from my generation and older may view more established norms as the standard for professional language. Older workers grew up with little awareness of stereotypes and biases and may not really be aware of the impact of our words. Also, English is often not the first language in Asia and other parts of the world, which makes changing a person's use of language more difficult and challenging. In some cultures, workplaces can be hierarchical, which means that it is a gap in mindset and worldviews, which will remain as a gap at the workplace if there is no intergenerational conversation. So that's one of the first steps, to have a conversation about what you're uncomfortable with if you notice it. And no matter what age we are, I think we need to be curious and understanding why something as important as language is changing at such a scale now. Gender non-binary language is also now in Swedish and in German, but in Asia, only Taiwan and Thailand are more progressive. But as long as there is a growing awareness and a solidarity of environmental issues, that we are really one earth, one people, I think that inclusive language will increasingly grow to be a mark of allyship to all people, and it's not going to go away. So the next step would just be to dive in and embrace it.
Thanks. And maybe as a follow-up question, Rain, if I can put you a bit on the spot, is technology, right? So besides verbal language, I think, chats, and then even I'm finding that with younger people, sorry, but if I'm, giving non-inclusive language, with the younger people, they tend to have acronyms, they tend to have different kinds of short forms, and it's not just in chats anymore. Sometimes it shows up in emails and even work emails. Do you think that is a challenge? How do we overcome some of this so that we are inclusive of both the younger ones and the older ones in terms of balancing the need for expression with the need to include?
I think the need of expression is also opportunity for communication. If there is something that we are not familiar with, and language is always evolving, I think that is actually a great opportunity to reach out across the younger generation to find out what's happening. You mentioned something about not using guys, but in some cultures, actually, that's what the younger generation is doing. It is completely acceptable to address an audience of different gender identities as "Hey guys," and part of it is to assume the best of interests and intentions of each other, so that helps a lot. What I am also concerned with is the use of digital channels, because very often you cannot hear, and sorry, this is ableist language, you cannot really sense the intention when you are just looking at words. And that's where actually more intentionality, and communication needs to be made in order to ascertain where the person is coming from. So communication at the end and inclusive language, it is really hard work. But once you understand each other a bit better and you are able to clarify, I think that will become much easier.
Yeah, thanks, Rain. Moving to Shaleen, we saw very interesting results with the poll earlier around mental health, as well as disability. With the pandemic, I would have thought that mental health, taking care of one's well-being, is becoming less of a taboo topic, and yet there was quite a few who have expressed that this is not an easy topic for them to talk about and to be inclusive in the use of language. So how do you see this evolving, and do you have some specific examples and tips for everyone?
Okay, so I'll address the discrepancy between the poll results a bit later, but in terms of seeing how inclusive language is evolving, I do see it evolving to be a great tool to foster healthy discussions on mental health. You know, because inclusive language helps reduce stigma, and people will start talking more about mental health, their mental health struggles. So this actually would help us have a clearer picture on the experiences of a wider range of people, so that people in the field, such as myself, you know, can make better observations. We can have a deeper understanding on the nuances of mental health. So because it's been stigmatized all this while, we don't really understand it as much as we should be. So in a sense, the evolution of inclusive language would contribute to the evolution of mental health as well. When the understanding of mental health evolves, more people can get specialized support, and of course, making our society a bit more healthy and inclusive of everyone. I also foresee that inclusive language will be normalized into our everyday language. And like I mentioned earlier, this helps us frame the understanding of our world, right? So this would help us to no longer attack the person, but to sort of solve the problem in a more systemic way. So for example, as mental health discussions in workplaces become more common, inclusive language will be sort of integrated into corporate culture and HR policies. To give an example, terms like burnout, right? We tend to use the word burnout a bit more frequently nowadays because people started talking about how their mental health is affected. And probably also because younger people are just a bit more comfortable talking and sharing about mental health. And the reason why burnout is more of an inclusive term, because we stop stigmatizing people for being lazy or for not performing, and we're able to see why they can't perform. And from there, you know, companies have incorporated policies to sort of manage burnout, you know, such as, you know, giving access to mental health services, flexible hours, you know, hybrid working, all of those things. So it's pretty clear that when inclusive language is sort of normalized into our everyday language, it actually does have like a snowball effect on how we can change systemic stuff and allow everyone to be more inclusive. So I would encourage everyone to also have more discussions on mental health. Even if you don't know what is inclusive or not inclusive, the more we have these conversations, the more we can understand what can be inclusive, what it's not, and how we can sort of improve. And like I said, inclusion and mental health discussion and mental health evolution comes hand in hand as well. So yeah.
Sorry, I was on mute. I remember a phrase that became very popular during the pandemic was this, it's okay not to be okay. And so that probably goes towards that normalization in some extent. And one of the things I started doing during after the pandemic was when people ask things like, how are you? It tends to be a very normal kind of like I don't know what you call, like question that people just kind of ask us, how are you today? And most people say, I'm fine. And I actually started testing people by saying, I'm not fine today, just to see where the conversation go. Of course, on that day when I say that, I'm not really 100%, right? But just really testing people and getting them to realize that even when you ask a question like, how are you today? Be prepared to accept an answer that isn't the usual, I'm okay or I'm fine, because then that opens the door, right, for that normalization as well. So great suggestions and tips from you. Before I move to Dr. Suba, I wanted to just make sure that everybody knows we can get questions from you. We will have time for questions. We want to answer your questions. So please, do use the functions on the platform to post your questions, and we'll be keeping an eye out for them. So, Dr. Suba, gender diversity has been a focus area for businesses, societies, and governments for quite a long time already. It's been since women's rights and suffrage, and then eventually evolving from binary to a much broader definition of gender identity. There's been an increasing sentiment, however, of gender fatigue in the corporate space around this over-focus on gender and women targets, for example. People have talked about wanting to move beyond gender diversity and broaden to other forms of diversity. That's what I hear a lot from companies. Do you think this could translate into a more ambivalent approach towards inclusive language around gender, when I feel that we haven't exactly totally achieved inclusion around that dimension?
I guess gender is like one part of the intersectionality of most people. So I don't know what this gender fatigue seems to be. Maybe it's fatigue from the higher ups, but I don't see it in the younger, newer people who just seem to be just accepting and more willing to change. And I like this, like we're discussing the evolution of language, right? Because if you prevent, it seems to be that those who are a little bit hesitant in mastering inclusive language are like hesitant to move away from status quo. But the status quo is changing, and it's going to change anyway. And it's just how much that communities are willing to change. In the corporate world, I guess, yes, definitely, women have a long way to go. We've come a long way, but we still are like, fighting the glass ceiling. But that's why we talk about universal design in most things, right? So if it's universally inclusive, then it should be universally inclusive for all, regardless of the intersectionality, regardless if you are talking about gender or race or nationality or disability or mental health, kind of young or age. So ageism and ableism definitely is something that's come to the forefront because we just never noted it before as an issue. It's always been an issue, but it's just not noted. I don't think that moving on from gender will just totally drop it. It's just that recognizing that different facets of identities come with intersectionality, which means that there is no one person that is stereotype of all identities. We are a mismatch. And being inclusive and universal in how we think and our approach is more important than actually the words, or like, people are bogged down on pronouns. That's not the point. The point is that we are more open to a society or an environment that's enabling and like welcoming to all, and it gives everybody a dignified space to be themselves.
Yeah, I love the comment you made on intersectionality. So we'll come back to that as a panel, just exploring that in a while. But first, I would want to move on to Michael for now. And Michael, earlier you alluded to gender diversity becoming more and more polarized. There's some challenges in Europe. Can you share a little bit more? What's going on? What's the case? What are some of the challenges in Europe?
If I would know that. Yes, happy to do that. And I think some of my of the other panelists also touched on this already a bit, right? Like there is some kind of fatigue maybe and so on. I think that's some topic. I think in general, like if we look at gender diversity, yes, gender is touching all of us, like to some extent, right? Like we were born into a society where you have to find your way around gender. Like some do it more consciously, some do it more subconsciously, or don't actively deal with it and don't actively go on a journey and say, yeah, I'm a male person, I'm a cis male person, for example. Yeah, a lot of cis male people will never come to the point where they actually reflect their gender and like actively say, yes, that's me. They're just accepting it. It's just part of who they are because they were born that way, or like they were assigned that gender at birth. What happens now, in my opinion, at least talking for German and also a bit the European lens, We are in very unstable, unsafe times. It's like there's a lot of things happening politically. There is wars happening and so on that are very close now. There was always wars, of course, but from a European perspective, they came closer, right? They are more present now. Like we have inflation, like so, and this is usually these are times where people tend to go for the safe option, to what they know, for what is stable. They try to preserve, to conserve. And that goes very hand in hand then politically again with, let's say, a more traditional view on gender identity, for example, right? Which doesn't mean that everyone now has a very traditional view on gender identity. However, that's what we can see in the political landscape in Europe in the last years. That's something that especially conservative parties are going for and using as their or as part of their identity, basically to preserve, right? So, and I think that makes it more and more complicated, or leads to more and more divide in that sense, at least on the surface. And that's the interesting part, because depending on how you ask someone what they think about inclusive language, or even gender inclusive language, to make it more precise, depending on the way you're asking, you will get totally different answers, you know? If you ask someone like, oh, should we ban gender completely, or should we remove gender completely from our documents and legal statuses and so on? A lot of people say, no, I want to keep that, right? Which I can understand. Like there's also like useful aspects of having gender in place. If I ask people, should everyone be forced to use gender inclusive language? You will get, of course, the answer that's like, oh, no, we don't want to force people to use certain kind of language and so on. Like, so if I ask, do you want to make sure that everyone feels included? You get a completely different answer, right? Like, so it really is the question, or it really depends on how you ask, and also how you educate people. And I think we touched also on this earlier, like there is, and that's also only natural, there is, and this goes for all the dimensions, by the way, not only gender diversity, there is in that sense a lack of education, a lack of knowledge, lack of awareness, first of all, that there is gender diversity, for example. You know, if you grow up in a world where there's only two genders, there's only male and female as an option, you might be confused now 60 years later when you hear, but there's people who don't identify as male and female, they identify as non-binary, for example. You might be confused, and then depending on your worldview, on your mindset, on your bubble, let's say, that you're in, you might be more open to explore that, and you might be more like, oh, that's interesting, I didn't know that, let me learn more about this. Or you're like, no, I reject, no, I don't want things to change. You know, I'd like, and that's again, from a privileged point of view, that's easy to say, I don't want things to change, right? So, and I think that's what's going on in Europe in the last year, or in the last years, is what's happening a lot. It's become very political. It became used as a political identity, like it's connected to, are you left, are you right? It's really connected to this. And at the same time, also language itself in Europe is very often politicized, and in the sense that, again, there's people who want to preserve the language, they want to keep the language as it is, whereas language actually always is evolving. We also had this earlier, right? Like it's always changing, there's always developing. And I think last point, and then I'm happy to hear other opinions also. Last point, I think language is also developing very different nowadays than it would, I don't know, 50 years ago. And we have a lot of digital channels, so it's way easier to communicate among your peers, be it age-wise, generation-wise, be it interest-wise, yeah. So you don't have to interact like back in the days where you would have, I don't know, your village or your town, and you have kind of this regional, this local development of language, and like it would kind of go, we would kind of than nowadays than back in the days, because it's so easy to just be in your little corner, in your little bubble, be it on LinkedIn, be it on Instagram, on TikTok, wherever you are. Like it's so easy to just have this and not see all the others. And that's, I think, another aspect that leads to more and more polarized view on language in general, not only gender inclusive language or inclusive language, but language in general, that's developing and probably developing very different for different generations or different interest groups. And I think that's a big challenge we don't have an answer to yet, or I don't have one. Maybe some of you have. And we have had never the situation also before as a society, as a world. Yeah, there was never the case before that we had this kind of instant digital interest-based communication groups. We never had that, like in that to that extent. So that's, I think, one of the biggest and most interesting challenges these days to solve.
Yeah. So that's another great piece to add to this next discussion. I think the whole issue of intersection or challenge, right, around intersectionality, around how some things are being politicized, etc. Sometimes you can feel like it's so scary to try and be inclusive. It's like, I do also wrong. I do it this way also wrong. I do it that way also wrong. Whichever way I try, the moment I open my mouth, I'm going to offend somebody. I'm going to exclude somebody. So it's really scary. And sometimes with that sort of a concept, people might say, maybe the best thing to do is keep my mouth shut and not communicate, which is, I can see all of you shaking your head. So can you perhaps comment on that and give some suggestions how people can overcome that fear and try? Because I think the reality is it is quite scary, right? Especially with cancel culture and everything else. You never know what tripwire you're going to hit and end up getting a lot of people kind of flaring up at you, for example. Yeah. And really popcorn. So whoever would like to pop first. Yeah. Just come off mute. Yeah, Shaleen.
Okay, I can answer first and then we'll go to Michael. So I also want to answer this question in relation to the poll earlier, when we noticed that ethnicity, mental health, disability, neurodiversity was kind of the hardest ones to be inclusive about. And the reason why I think it's really, in addition to what Michael was saying, is the lack of knowledge, right, about these topics. Neurodiversity has become a more recent topic nowadays, especially with younger people talking about, for example, ADHD and autism, and people don't know enough about it to be able to speak about it. So it is really important for us to also understand the sort of historical, cultural, and political context behind these, ethnicities, for example, or mental health, disabilities, neurodiversity, because that's how we shaped our language in the past, right? So terms like crazy and psycho were very much used in the past, and that was okay. But now we know that sometimes these terms were used to, punish people, you're used to segregate people. So understanding the historical context can really help you understand what is okay and what is not okay. And normally what I like to try to do is to decolonize my language. Is to do research. And the thing that really helps me is to go online and, you can go on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook and stuff. And there's so many content creators that talk about inclusion from various different identities. So following this and educating yourself is super important for you to know why certain language is inclusive and not. Knowing why helps you a lot, not just following what people are saying. That's one. I also think asking people, like what Dr. Subha said just now, right? Asking people what feels comfortable to you, what would help you, what would you want me to say? That is, of course, showing people that you're respecting them, and different people, even though generally, let's say for Indian people, we might say, oh, it's okay to call this term, it's fine. Then there's some who say, it's not okay. So you might want to clarify with the person that you're engaging with. So always asking them. And lastly, what I would think is important is it's not always about knowing. Sometimes we can't know everything, right? It's going to take us forever to know everything. But it's more about the attitude you have about wanting to be inclusive. Just like how Shoon does not mention, like, okay, I'm sorry if this is, this may be, non-inclusive. I'm going to try harder. It's more about that. It's me wanting to show that I actually want to put in an effort. So you apologize, and then you give people the space to correct you and to educate you. And then you try again, and you just keep trying. So it's okay to mess up. It's really about your attitude about wanting to be more inclusive. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Thanks, Shaleen. So I think your tip is, just say, I'm trying. Please please forgive me. Please give me coaching. Please, I think that's very, very helpful. So I think that helps disarm the whole situation.
I have maybe
Michael?
one add to this, and I'm totally with you. And I would add, because that helped me once very well. If you receive a feedback from someone that this was sexist language or racist language or whatever, right? You get a feedback. Very often, our first reaction is we feel attacked, we feel like judged, we feel like ashamed, maybe, and so on. And it's okay to feel these feelings, but I think there's important things. First of all, it's not about you in that situation. That's very important. And second, and that helped me a lot, was if someone is giving you a feedback on your communication, it means they believe you can do better. You know, like if they would not think you can do better, they would not mind. You know, a black person who is being discriminated every day against, who is every day getting some racist comments and so on, they will not bother to give you a feedback if they don't believe and don't want you to do better, right? And I think that for me was once very helpful to understand and to change my mindset. Basically, if I get a feedback, to not go into a like rejecting and like, but I didn't mean it and so on, but to, oh, okay, thank you very much for that. I wasn't aware. I will think about this. Thank you. You know, and because people mean or think you can do better. And I think this is especially for let's say the privileged groups or like non-minority groups. I think very important as a mindset that if you receive a feedback, people think you can do better, and that means take it, work with it, and ideally do better.
Love the reframing of how to receive the feedback. So thank you for that. So I know, Shaleen, you had your hands up, and then Dr. Suba as well. So maybe Shaleen first. Yeah.
Yeah, just really quick, I wanted to add on to a little bit of what I said just now. I know I said to ask people for help, right? But you must remember that it's not the responsibility of, minority groups to educate you. It is your responsibility to learn. You can ask this so that it's specific to each person, but if you are from a group of privilege, then it is your responsibility to go and learn it yourself without expecting people to teach. So yeah.
Do the self-work. Yeah. So Suba, you had your hand up as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree with Shaleen. And also, like, to the point of when we are talking about language and in the corporate sector, right, or in institutions, I think we've been talking a lot on how the responsibility of individuals are and how we react. But like as a feminist, I want the system change, right? I want the whole system to be better. And I think it's not only on the responsibility of individuals, it's like the corporation, the employers, the whole institution needs to take responsibility in including and like adopting inclusive language, or at least the willingness to learn and change. So it shouldn't be just like on the responsibility of individuals.
Thanks. And Rain.
I'm just going to give a couple of practical tips. And it comes down to how do you change your pattern of language? How do you change the way that your brain is thinking? And for me, it helps when I spend some time to drill down what is that word or phrase I'm using that is the trigger. And in design thinking, we have this concept of asking yourself the 5 whys in order to understand what is that deeper motivation or what is the link to your higher order needs. So that accounts for the shortcut that your brain is thinking is doing that makes you say it. And when you spend that introspective time to reevaluate what is that fundamental view that is making you say something this way, and that's one way of rewiring your verbal systems.
So as we're wrapping up the panel, I do have one other question for the 4 of you. And again, feel free to pop whichever way popcorn approach to the panel. And this question is kind of flipping it the other way. We talk about responsibility to learn, but also I think responsibility to intervene. So I would love to get your suggestions as a panelist on when you see non-inclusive language and you're trying to give coaching and maybe support. So, support to the one where the non-inclusive language was effected on. and then also coaching for the one who is the source of that non-inclusive language. Can you give some tips? What's the best way to do this, and what mistakes to avoid from your experience?
From my experience, it's not easy. Yes, definitely, because there's definitely a power relation. From those who are not using inclusive language, they probably have a little bit more power than the minority that would like to be included. I think it's on the onus of us to slowly to step in anyway. The bystander effect can be really important, and just to say that, like, for example, for ableist language, it's so common to say that previously we did this, but now it's not accepted anymore, or it might it might hurt somebody's feelings, or just to include it like that, to not. And you don't have to be very high about it, but to try to explain that a non-inclusive way of speaking and having conversations actually is causing a negative implications to other people. So I think we have a responsibility also to do that. If we have, we should try, and also create a space that's safe enough so that we can actually step up. Because those who are usually, I don't know who mentioned it at the end of like accepting racist, ableist, and discriminatory language, usually they've just had it. They've had so much of this minority stress. It's unfair that we expect them to step up by themselves.
So how we can step up and help them along the way if we see something happen. Yeah, thank you. Michael, you're raising your hand.
Yeah, if I may add, I absolutely agree. It's a question of power in a lot of context, say in the work context and business context. In a way, even more, because usually your salary depends on it and so on, like your income, like the way to maintain your life. So there is a lot of struggles there, and I think that's why it's especially not especially there, but also they're important. For if you're part of a privileged group, that you really act as an ally and really step in and really say, hey, that's not okay, that's not funny, that's not, for example, I myself, I'm a white cis male hetero guy, so I'm like, in most cases I'm the privileged one. I'm, and in terms of identity, I have the more powerful position. So for me, it's usually easier in a work context to speak up and to also challenge this. Now, as a consultant anyway, I'm coming from an external perspective, so I'm to some extent paid for that. That depends really how honest, how real is the intention of the company engaging us to actually change, to actually challenge their power dynamics, their communication, their ways of doing business. And unfortunately, not every company wants to do that. A lot of companies are still like rainbow washing or pink washing, and they're just like, yeah, we want to have a guideline or something, but then it shouldn't be too strong. We should not really ask our employees to actually like use it and so on. Like, it needs to be like slow, and we need to adapt slow and so on, and which is also fine. It's a way of change also. However, if you want to have real change, if you want to really support people from minorities, then it's in the end about leadership making this a priority in terms of budget, in terms of resources, in terms of stepping up, in terms of being a role model, in terms of intervening in situations. And this is also happening, luckily, not as much as the others, I would say, yet, but it's happening. I think that's in the end very the ideal scenario, where you have backing from top leadership, because then everyone in the organization can refer to this, because if you have the CEO or the board saying inclusivity is a topic for us, this is our number one priority here, we want to be an inclusive workplace, we want to have an inclusive culture, then everyone down the hierarchy can refer to this. And even if my manager then is against this, I can bring it up with this person on top. again, it needs to be honest. It needs to be really the priority in order to do that, because otherwise, yeah, you all know how that will end. But yeah, and Shaleen, I think you have a raised hand, so
Yeah.
I hand over to you.
Okay, yeah, just really quickly. I think what Dr. Subara and Michael has mentioned, of course, the power plays a big part. But I think, let's say, if you don't have power and you don't know how to still intervene, I think modeling is a really good option as well. So if someone is using a non-inclusive term, I can just continue. When I speak, I can use the more inclusive term so that people will know that there's extra language that they can use. Sometimes people don't know what language to use instead. So I think modeling then can help. Just to make them a bit more comfortable to use this term, and then maybe the next time they might actually adopt it instead. So that's something that you can try.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion as well. And particularly in the APEC context, less confrontational, so a more subtle approach that could work too. Thank you for sharing. And Rain, last but not least, before we close the panel, your thoughts on how to intervene and support.
I'll give a couple of tips. I think that aside from suggesting the right use of terms, which is a great idea, it helps to reframe it in their own identity if they are not empathizing with the person that they have offended. For example, with male privilege, perhaps some of us do not understand why is there so much focus right now on menopause when there's actually andropause. And it helps for the person to understand that this is not a zero-sum game. Having a focus on this doesn't mean that there should not be any focus on something else. And I think it will help for people to understand that, that the field is really much bigger. Help them to understand and level up to see the systemic issue that is at hand. For example, this would be about the systemic issue of the inequality of women. And once we can see that our identities are intersectional, the whole andropause conversation actually indicates that there is a lot more to be done for healthier male emotional expression. Another way is also to ask rather what you think of that conversation. What do you feel about the conversation that we just had? And open the person's mind to what the other person might be feeling. It's just like, oh, it's great that you felt this way, but I kind of feel that so and so was really uncomfortable, and here's why. So using all this bridging and using a very appropriate type of calming and non-aggressive tone, even though we might be kind of like bubbling inside. So those are the tips from me.
Yeah, thanks, Rain. And with that, we've come to the end of the panel, but not yet the end of the session. We have a very quick, short workshop with some more practical tips on how to use inclusive language just coming up shortly. But I would first like to express my appreciation, and I'm sure all of your appreciation for the session with Michael, Suba, Shaleen, and Rain, who have been such exceptional panelists and so open to sharing and generous in sharing all of their tips and their experiences. And also, as you can see, a word of thanks as well to our sponsors that are listed here, Marsh McLellan, Chubb, QBE, Munich Re, and Kennedy's Legal Solutions, without which we wouldn't have this session. So thank you so much for such an engaging discussion. And we move now to just applying more the learnings from the panel into a very short workshop on mastering inclusive language that I'll take you through. So thank you very much. And so with that, just want to really bring this to a more practical approach. And when we think about inclusive language, I think we first have to consider the notion of inclusive leadership. And I bring here an example of a model that we have. Very often we think about inclusive language or inclusive leadership or inclusive behaviors as outwards from us, how we interact with the world. But at Russell Reynolds, we often also emphasize the intrapersonal. So what's going on inside your head? What's going on inside your heart? What's going on inside you, physically, physiologically, emotionally. So we talk about awareness and clarity, that it's not just about your awareness and clarity and need to foster an open dialogue with others, but first and foremost, to the point that was brought up by Michael and Suba about power and privilege, knowing what is your power and what is your privilege, what is your motivation, and then also knowing your capability around inclusive language is really, really important, first and foremost. So the self-work, and I think Shaleen has also talked about how taking responsibility. So the intrapersonal piece is really you taking responsibility for yourself, first and foremost, before you can actually channel that outwards to be more inclusive of others. And once you have the awareness and clarity, you are then able to hold yourself accountable before you hold others accountable, because it's really important that you don't just intervene on others, but how you role model, to the example that was given by Shaleen around. Maybe we can just be role modeling it and showing others how it's done. Empowering others is also important. So recognizing, as Michael had brought up, that if a person who is Black brings you feedback, actually, they probably experienced the exclusions for so many times that it's really, it's tiring for them to keep stepping up, to keep intervening. And Dr. Suba also mentioned that. So how do we recognize that, and we can reflect with empathy so that when we give feedback and when we provide support, we are actually being an ally to them. And then the last piece around innovative collaboration. Can we bring this to a new level as it evolves? Can we teach others? Can we read the situation and recognize how do we give coaching and intervening in order then to give that feedback so that people will evolve in the way that they interact with others? So that's just giving you a sense of a framework around thinking about inclusive language and how you lead as an individual, even without so-called organizational power. Each one of us on the intrapersonal side can definitely develop ourselves and then bring that into our interactions with others. So with that, I want to apply something called the 4 stages of learning towards inclusive language. So essentially, with anything that we learn, not just inclusive language, we start with being in the red quadrant on the top right side, which is unconscious incompetence. That means we don't even know that we don't know. And so if I just apply this to an example around disability and maybe hearing impairment, a question that I would have to ask is, what am I unaware of? That's very challenging, because if you don't know what you don't know, how would you even know that you don't know? So it's usually triggered by an external event or an external factor. So it might be that you bumped into somebody and you made a comment like, "Oh, blind or what?" When actually the person is really blind. Or, "Hey, I called out from behind and you can't hear, deaf or what?" And then that trigger event actually made you realize that, hey, there's a lot of things that you don't know, So that becomes something that you ask yourself, okay, what is it that I don't know? And how do I uncover that? And once you encounter the external trigger situation, the question that is very important is, what are you going to do about it? Do you make a learning plan to address what you're unaware of? And you start to think about who to speak to and when to do that, setting some timelines for yourself. So in my case, with disability, it really started with one of the companies that I was working with, Microsoft, employing an intern who is hearing impaired. And then he ran a sign language workshop, which I attended. And then he introduced the deaf culture. So suddenly I had this trigger that told me that there was so much that I didn't know. And one of the panelists talked about curiosity, right? So that piqued my curiosity, and I decided to make a learning plan and a commitment to learn sign language. But even then, when I made that commitment, I wouldn't know where to go, who to go to. So I went up to the intern and I asked some questions, and then he pointed me in the right direction of, here are some options, and then I have to take responsibility to go online, search for the courses, make the booking, etc. So we get into that situation then of conscious incompetence. That means now I know that I don't know something, and I've set up that plan to go and learn. So what do I not know how to do? In this case, I don't know how to communicate with people who are deaf. And so I have to actively, as part of my learning strategy, seek out those people, ask how they want to be treated to feel included, identify areas of focus for practice, and just find out those opportunities. So I signed up for courses, and I intentionally not just signed up for courses, I seeked out the deaf community in Singapore and interacted with them. And I ask questions. So sometimes I ask like, oh, okay, how do I know whether I'm doing this right? Am I being sensitive, too sensitive? For example, with the deaf community, we were running some booths and fairs. Do I take a step back and let them interact with the members of the public? Or do I take over which may actually disempower them. So I actually have to discuss this and talk to them up front. I've also asked them questions like, if I'm walking around with you as a person who is hearing impaired, and somebody makes a comment that shows that they clearly do not know that you are hearing impaired and it's insensitive, should I intervene and how should I intervene? I actually discussed that up front with them. Now, as I am going along now, and I've been learning sign language for 2 years now, I get to a place where I get to what we call conscious competence. That means I know that I know. It's not yet unconscious in terms of practice. For me to switch to sign language, for me to, when I walk into a room where I know there are people who are hearing impaired, I have to actually pause and say, okay, mentally switch on to sign language mode, switch on to the way of thinking about it differently. But the important question to ask here is, how am I doing? And asking for feedback regularly from them. Say, am I doing good? Have I used the wrong signs? Am I looking frustrated? Am I too slow? And so on and so forth. So the key thing here to do is to keep practicing. So practice, practice, practice. What was mentioned by Shaleen was that and Dr. Suba was this thing about just continue to practice, because the more you practice, the more you normalize it, and the more you yourself get to a sense of competence around it. So how do you reflect and review and get feedback from others, but also balancing that? You don't want to be asking for feedback all the time and then they are fatigued with it as well. Then as we move on and practice and practice and practice, we get to a place of unconscious competence. So just quickly checking, because my screen has frozen. I am still streaming. Hopefully I am, because my screen is not moving at all. My video is frozen, but can you hear me? Okay, so I'm still streaming the audio. I do apologize about the technology. So I'll just continue, and I do apologize that I've been frozen, but hopefully it doesn't look too terrible or hilarious. So the last area where we get to in the 4 stages of learning is what we call unconscious competence. And this means that you are now in a situation where you don't know that you know. And the question to ask once you get to that, place of unconscious competence is really, what else am I unaware of? And so what do I mean by that? After 2 years of practicing sign language, I'm getting a little bit more fluent, but I know that I'm not yet there. Eventually, I will get to a place where I'm probably signing as fast as somebody else who is an expert. But what I then have to realize is, if I go to another country, maybe there's a culture that's different in terms of how they sign. So sign language in Korea, or sign language in Germany, or sign language in the USA, and the deaf culture is different. So how am I continuing to keep myself away from a comfort zone of, oh, okay, I've mastered it, I'm so wonderful, and a sense of superiority, but really continuing to ask myself, what else am I unaware of? And how is this continuing to evolve? And how else can I learn? So continue to seek out feedback from people. And in this case, maybe different people than the ones that was along with you on that learning journey. And also asking for suggestions for increasing your practice. So one of the other things I've started doing recently is what I call song signing. So instead of just signing for communication, I'm learning how to sign songs. So that as I'm hearing the song, I'm signing it so that the deaf community can participate in it with me. Now, one of the interesting things you may have heard is that I use the word deaf instead of hearing impaired. And that was because I actually did ask the community in Singapore to say, how would they like to be referenced? And where I had thought that it was hearing impairment is the correct, politically correct phrase to use, it turned out that they preferred the word deaf. So you can see I'm using it interchangeably, but that's the important thing about not making an assumption. And really thinking about how they want to be included, how they want to be treated, and then including that into your practice. I'm going to move to the next slide, and hopefully the technology is still working. And this is just giving you some practical tips to trigger your action plan along that 4 stages of learning. So here are some examples. And the first example is sharing of power in language. So Michael and Suba had talked about power positions, but sometimes we also have what we call power exertion in language. Oh dear. So I see that the slides have not moved as well. My video is not working. So just give me 2 seconds. I'm just going to move out of my screen. I'm going to leave the call and rejoin, and Tag will just patch me back in again. Do apologize. Yeah, I'm going to just leave the call and rejoin. Everyone, can you hear me? I do apologize. I am having some issues with technical support, so I'm just going to continue, and then we'll make sure we get the slides out to you. But just some practical tips then in wrapping up to how you can activate your learning plan. So there's a slide that just explains that, but I can also just visually, verbally talk you through it. So the first is sharing of power in language. So very often we are very unconscious about how we might speak. An example is, I would like you to do X. I want you to do this. And that's actually a power piece that pushes your power down on others. A more inviting way to really level set on power and share power in language is actually to use the word let's. So instead of saying, I want you to send an email to John by end of day today, you could say, would you send an email out to John by end of day today, or let's get an email out to John by end of day today. So that's another way to just kind of bring down the power dynamic in language. The second one is gender neutral language. So asking, and we saw that in the poll where some of you were referencing things like manager, doctor, and people tend to use the word he. So if you were speaking to somebody and you say, who is your manager? I would like to speak to him. Or that notion that was brought up about, hi guys. Those are some examples where there's gender assumptions built into the language that you're using. So try and open it up and say, who is your manager? I would like to speak to them. So that gives a possibility that it could be a woman or a man, for example. Instead of hi guys, perhaps an appropriate term could be hi team or hi everyone. And then ability inclusivity is another example. that I would give you and as a consideration. So very often Rain talked about trigger words. So if I were making a presentation and I said, as we can see on this slide, that is an example of an assumption around ability. Perhaps a more inclusive way to practice ability inclusion is to say something along the lines of, this slide shows that XXX. So that's another example. One of the things that is my pet peeve, actually, if I move on to accessibility as well, is accessible hashtags. And oftentimes you see people using hashtags and they will hashtag, and so example, hashtag inclusive language. The problem is when you hashtag inclusive language and you use everything in small caps, then screen readers is actually not helpful in picking that up. And so another example that I would suggest is if you do use hashtags, to hashtag and then for each word to start the first letter of that word with caps. So if you had inclusive language, you would have capital I, inclusive, and then capital L, language. That actually enables somebody with a visual impairment to use a screen reader to still decipher the hashtag. Some other examples of inclusion in language is, for example, when you think about not just written words, but the media that you use, the pictures that you use in accompaniment to, say, documents. Are you using diversity in your visual optics? So sometimes we are in a rush. We might just be creating PowerPoint slides or documents, and we pick the first available image that suits the brief. What is more inclusive is challenging ourselves and looking hard at that picture, just taking a few seconds and asking who else is missing in that image. Is the image showing all men? Is the image showing everybody of a certain nationality only? Are some groups, ethnic groups missing? Are some people with disabilities missing? Is there age diversity in the images? So that important step that you can take to ensure diversity in the media that accompanies your documents. And the last two that I will talk about is still on documents, accessible documents. Very often we might be designing for aesthetics. Something looks pleasant in terms of color, in terms of layout. We might merge certain cells on a table so that it looks visually more appealing. We might try and squeeze more words into a single slide because that was the requirement. Those are some examples of challenges around accessible documents. Ideally, in order to ensure that documents are accessible, the minimum font size, meaning the smallest font size that you should go into is 11. Anything less than 11, it's hard for anybody with visual impairment or somebody who is older to be able to read comfortably. Ensuring that spacing between fonts, between rows is also important. So single spacing or 1.5 for comfort in reading. Selecting accessible fonts like sans serif is really important. Having high color contrast between your words and your backdrop color, and using colorblind friendly templates so that people with color blindness are able to still benefit from the use of color visuals in your document. So those are just some examples of considerations. And then in my last example was actually how I started the session, and that was on inclusive and visual introductions. I could have started with, hi, my name is Shoon, and then just gone on to the dialogue. But I took a few more seconds, about half a minute, to introduce myself and give you my pronouns and describe myself as a Chinese woman with short brown hair and what I'm wearing today. This is actually very, very important because you never know who is in the room. And when you do not know who is in the room, whether they are somebody with a visual impairment, color blindness, perhaps they're from a different culture, so they don't know what is your ethnicity. Those are ways that you actually invite people to feel that this is a safe space for them to be authentically who they are, because I'm showing up authentically as who I am. So what I'd like you to remember then is you never know who's in the room. So when you do visual introductions as well, you'll be surprised. I have had people come up to me and share, thank you, I actually have color blindness, or I'm the invisible person that every time people assume can see clearly who is speaking, but actually I can't. So it's actually been quite empowering. And one thing to think about, therefore, is inclusion is a muscle, and you need to exercise that very regularly. When you do not intentionally include, you will unintentionally exclude. So with all of these tips, I hope that you will be able to, practice inclusive language going forward, and just become more intentional every day, exercise your inclusion muscle. I would like to go back to the Menti, and unfortunately, because I'm not able to share screen, I will just give you the instructions verbally, that if you can go into the Mentimeter, so menti.com, and then the code we will use is 54006318. I'll just repeat that, 54006318. We do have one last poll for you that we would like to ask for your inputs on. And the poll question is asking, what is one action you are committed to take to raise awareness on the value of inclusive language? And we'd love to hear your response from the 90 minutes that we've spent with you. What is one commitment you're going to take to be more inclusive in language? So if you go into menti.com and use the code 54006318, we would love to hear from you. And if you have questions as well, please feel free to put them in the chat, in the platform, and then we'll address them as well. Thank you. We had somebody come in and share that it's always to ask the other person how you're referring to them is appropriate. Wonderful. So the code, the Menti code is 54006318 on menti.com. Suggestions are pouring in, and these are great suggestions. We'll share them back out with the group as well, so that everyone here has the opportunity to learn from each other. Wow, somebody said practice to sing a song by sign language. And someone has said share some of the comments with my managers. Okay. And someone was saying that they're going to contact their comms team and ask them to stop starting company town halls with phrases like ladies and gentlemen. And I got feedback that inclusivity is a muscle. So yes, thank you. It's really important for us to remember to be intentional. So with that, we are at the hour. I just want to acknowledge everyone's participation. Thank you for staying with us through 90 minutes. I hope this has been very useful for you. Do apologize for the technical challenge that we had just now midway through the workshop. We will get the slides as well as the Menti responses out to everybody on the conference site, event site as well. So thank you very much, and I wish you a wonderful rest of day ahead, whether you're just starting it or whether you are ending it shortly. Thank you very much.